Hey viewers, welcome to the channel. If you have a macro that needs to open an external workbook, either to import or export data, if it resides in a shared location, it's a good chance you'll encounter file contention. So I'm going to show you how to deal with different scenarios of contention using VBA. Now I'll be splitting the video into two parts. Today's video, part one, we're going to look at basic or standard way of opening workbooks that doesn't have any explicit code for dealing with contention. In other words, it's just going to use the Excel VBA default behavior for doing that. And I'm going to see how it fares against the different scenarios. In part two, I'll be sharing with you how I deal with file contention. Now, firstly, these are the different scenarios that I'll be looking at. So when the macro runs, the workbook that we're going to open is either not in use by this user, the one who's running the macro, in use by another user, but the workbook is not a shared workbook, or a shared workbook. In each case, the macro will either be reading or writing to that external workbook. Let's take a look at the code. As I mentioned, we're going to be using just a generic approach for opening external workbooks. Any file contention is going to rely on Excel VBA's default behavior, which is quite limited and not very flexible. I have some variables defined up the top. I'll talk about some of these as we go through it. First one, I just like to assign the path separator to a variable. You could just, if you wanted to, you just use the backslash instead of application.pathSeparator, or you could just hard code this in the actual path. For read is a boolean. Once the workbook is open, if I'm reading, just import the data. If I'm writing, output some data. And save workbook is again a boolean, and it's going to determine whether the workbook is saved or not. Next, I assign the full path and file name. I'm just using a specific path and file. It's in the inputs folder where I'm running the macro. It's a subfolder within that. Now in part two, I'll show you how to use the open file dialog. It has no real bearing on how we handle the file contention. Workbooks.Open and the file. So opening the file and assign it to the WB workbook variable, which we've defined up the top here. Right, so now once it's open, we're going to get the default sheet, which is sheet 1 in this case. And then if the macro wants to read, all I'm doing is just copying the reused range and pasting it into F3 of this workbook. So this is doing the import. Nothing really exciting. If we're not reading, we're writing, I'm just going to do a simple updating one of the prices that are in the workbook. Then at the very end, closing the workbook. Now if we're writing to it, so save workbook equals true, it will save it. If we're reading, save workbook will be false, and it will just close it without saving. And that's pretty much it. Pretty straightforward approach. Open the workbook, do something with it, close the workbook, either save or don't save. And write these here, open workbook, do something with it, and close. Either save or don't. Just a quick reminder, the code we just went through is not how I typically open workbooks. That will come in part two. This is just a general approach that doesn't explicitly handle file contention. And that's what we're going to be testing with these scenarios. All right, with the first scenario, the macro runs, but the workbook is not in use. So open workbook, no issue. We can do something to it. We can import the data or write to it, no issue there. Close the workbook, don't save or save, again, not a problem. No file contention issues. The second scenario is that the workbook is already opened by this user. So the user that will be running the macro. In this case, it's me. Now let's say I'm working on the pricing. I make some changes that I'm happy with and I save them. I make some other changes, but I haven't saved them yet. Then I head off to lunch. I come back and remember I need to run the macro. So let's see how it handles it. So here's a source file. I'm going to make some changes and save them. I'll just highlight those green so we know which ones have been saved. Right, and save. And then I'll make a couple that I'll change the values, but I'm not going to save yet. So that will be blue and blue. I'm not saving these. Leave the workbook open, head off to lunch, and when I come back, I run the macro. The first scenario is going to be read. So I'll be importing that data. So we set this to for read. All right. So it's going to open the workbook, but because it's already open, it just uses that instance. Do something, it's going to import the data that is there. So there is a potential issue. We could be importing data that is incomplete or inaccurate. The next issue is it's going to close the workbook that I'd left open. So there's one thing. Secondly, it's not going to save. So I'm going to lose the changes that I hadn't committed yet. So if our macro doesn't handle these situations, we could have potential issues. Now this is going to depend on user requirements. Let me demonstrate it. All right, so we've imported both the saved values and haven't saved yet. These may be used by the rest of this macro or workbook, and we could have incorrect results. Let's take a look at what it's done to the source file. First of all, it's closed it. So here it is. As you can see, we have our saved values, but we've lost the other two that we hadn't saved. So this is not in sync with what I've imported. Now let's take a look at the right scenario. So I'm going to change this. Let's say I want to reduce the value to 450. And we'll make it blue again. And this one here, I'm going to make 480 and leave it open. I'll just clear this. Let's go back to the macro and make sure that we're writing. When we're writing or outputting to the worksheet, it's going to fall into this bit of code, incrementing the current value in D6 by 50 cents. So this here should change to $5, but I wanted it to be $4.50. So there's a potential issue. Open Workbook is going to use that instance, do something, it's going to increment the value by 50 cents, and then it's going to close the workbook on me and save those changes. So if I'm not paying attention, I've got the wrong value in the source file. Let me demonstrate it. Finished. So we haven't imported any data. Let's take a look at the source file again, which has been closed on us. It saved the data, but it incremented D6 by 50 cents. I originally wanted it to be $4.50. Now, if I hadn't opened this workbook again, I wouldn't realize that that's what's happened. So with this scenario, I would also say there are potential issues if we just use the standard approach and don't handle any file contention. The next scenario is that the workbook is already in use by another user, but it's not a shared workbook. Now, in order to simulate this outside the office, I'll open the workbook as administrator, and that will act as another user. The macro will run under my account. So I've opened the source as administrator, so this is the other user. When the macro runs and opens a workbook, it will create a separate instance that's read-only. In our read scenario, it's going to import data, and this could be a potential issue. As we mentioned before, it could be incomplete data because the other user has it opened. When it comes to close, that's not an issue. It's going to close the read-only instance and it won't save it. So, potential issues. Let me demonstrate it. So we've imported the data successfully. However, it could be incomplete. I'll just clear this so we can demonstrate the write scenario. Change for read to be false. And again, we're just going to be incrementing the value by 50 cents. So when the macro runs, opens a workbook, again, separate instance and read only because the other user has it open. Do something, we're going to increment that value. It will allow it to do it in the separate instance. The issue comes when we go to close the workbook. Because it's trying to save, it's going to pop up a save as dialog. So this has a couple of issues. First of all, it's interrupted the macro process. The reason for macros usually is to try and automate as much as possible without user intervention. So if the user starts, the macro goes off to get a coffee, comes back, they're presented with this save as dialog, and they're going to have to choose where to save it. That's the other issue, is that we're not updating the intended workbook. All right, so let's see this. Run. Here's our save as dialog. Save as. And the file name has defaulted to copy of source. Now, okay, the user can save it. Okay, but it's not the right workbook. So in this scenario, we have definite issues using just the general approach, which doesn't handle any file contention. Now the final scenario is opening a shared workbook. Now outside the Office environment, I can only demonstrate legacy workbook sharing. However, co-authoring of SharePoint and OneDrive should be a similar concept. Now when the macro opens a shared workbook, it shouldn't be an issue. When it goes to read or import the data, that shouldn't really be an issue. However, if you think about shared workbooks, are usually designed such that each user is updating either a particular section for their team or individually for themselves. However, if a macro is reading from a shared workbook, it's typically going to be importing the combined users' updates. So there's a potential that it imports incomplete data. So to demonstrate this, I've shared the source workbook and opened it as administrator. So here's the source and you can see that it's shared. Now the other user, the administrator, changes this to $4.50. Haven't saved it yet. And the macro is going to import the old data. Now let's say there are a number of tabs that had to be updated by various users. Some of them may not have got round to it yet, and so the macro would have imported out of date or incomplete data. So what about a macro writing to a shared workbook? Well, technically that shouldn't be a problem. However, you need to consider a few things. So the macro opens a workbook, not a problem. It tries to write to the shared workbook, not an issue. However, we need to keep in mind that if the macro makes updates that causes multiple conflicts, then the users at the other end will need to resolve them, and that could be frustrating. Secondly, if there are multiple updates, whether they cause conflicts or not, it could impact the performance, lock up the file for the other users. On the flip side, while the macro is running, users make some changes which cause conflicts to be resolved on the macro side. And so it's going to interrupt the process, and the user running the macro will need to resolve them before the macro can continue. So I'm going to demonstrate how conflict resolution can interrupt the macro. I'll just change this to write mode. Now, in order for me to make changes as the other user while the macro is running, I'll need to pause the execution of the code just before the save. I'll put a breakpoint here where we increment the value. Now, if you're not familiar with breakpoints, it's part of the VBA debugger. Please check out my how to use the debugger in VBA. It's a very handy tool. Now, importantly, in order to create the conflict, the user also has to change the same cell, so it'll be D6. All right, so it's open the workbook, and the code stops just before it increments the value. I'll press F8 just to execute this line of code, and zoom in. We can see that the value is 6.5. So the macro believes it's 6.5. At the same time, the user is changing this to 6.7 and saves it. Back to the macro, I'm going to press F5 to let it continue. And instead of finishing, the resolve conflicts dialog pops up. So the macro has been interrupted. The user will need to resolve it before it can continue. And there, now it's finished. So in this scenario, writing to a shared workbook with macros can definitely have issues, and I would say avoid. So that's all the scenarios I wanted to cover. Clearly, dealing with file contention using the standard or general approach of opening workbooks does have limitations. Now in part 2, I'll be sharing with you how I deal with them, much more flexible, and lets you pick and choose what you allow and what you don't allow, depending on the user requirements. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on future videos. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.